"Don't be late again tonight, Carson. We have the company party." Heather's voice floated from the kitchen, the sound of mugs clinking together following closely behind. Carson stood by the front door, pretending to check something on his phone. He was stalling, trying to keep his emotions in check, though they threatened to surge from beneath the surface. Her voice, casual as ever, carried a weight that felt far from comforting now. It was a reminder, a subtle warning of the night ahead. He glanced toward the kitchen, watching as she reached for the coffee pot. She was the same Heather he had known for more than a decade, at least on the outside. Her hair still fell the same way, her movements practiced, her perfume lingering in the air. It was all so familiar, yet something had changed between them in ways neither of them dared acknowledge. "I won't miss it," Carson muttered, forcing his voice to remain neutral as he slipped his phone into his pocket. He moved across the room and took the cup of coffee she offered him. Their hands brushed for a brief moment, but it was as though the touch had no warmth. It hadn't for months. Heather gave him a quick smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Carson noticed how stiff her shoulders seemed, how she shifted slightly on her feet. He didn't care. Good. Jasper's going to be there. You know, he's the life of the party. Her voice held a trace of excitement, one that Carson recognized too well. His stomach twisted at the mention of Jasper's name. He watched as Heather's fingers twitched slightly around the coffee cup's handle. She wasn't just talking about her boss. Carson could hear the subtle hint in her voice. She wasn't simply looking forward to seeing Jasper. She was eager. Carson took a sip of his coffee and nodded, maintaining a calm exterior. He couldn't afford to react, to let her know that he knew. "Jasper's quite the character," he said, keeping the tone as neutral as possible. The words felt hollow as he said them. In his mind, the thought of Jasper, the smug, arrogant man who had been sleeping with his wife for years, made him sick. He had suspected something was wrong between Heather and Jasper from the start. At first, it was just small things, late nights at the office, excuses about work emergencies, and increasing emotional distance. But when her unexplained absences became more frequent, and her enthusiasm for work grew suspiciously intense, Carson's instincts told him there was more to it. One night, after Heather came home late again, Carson sat there, watching her sleep. He already knew. He didn't need proof. He could feel it in the coldness that had settled between them, the way she barely looked at him anymore, the disinterest in her eyes when they spoke. That night, Carson made a decision. He wasn't going to confront her. Not yet. He needed to know the full truth first. And so, he hired a private investigator. The results came back faster than he had anticipated. A manila envelope filled with pictures, texts, and emails that told the whole story. Jasper and Heather had been having an affair for years. It wasn't just a brief fling. It was something far more calculated, something deeper. Carson remembered the night he sat on the edge of the bed, flipping through the photos. There they were, his wife and Jasper in various intimate moments. Hotel rooms, out-of-town business trips that Heather had claimed were essential for her career. In every image, Heather's face was filled with joy, a joy that had been missing from their marriage for far longer than Carson cared to admit. It wasn't the evidence that broke him. It was the realization of how long he had been living a lie. But Carson didn't rage. He didn't destroy the photos or storm into the bedroom to wake her. Instead, he chose a different path. He waited. He wasn't going to confront her in a fit of anger. That would have been too easy for both her and Jasper. Carson knew he had to play the long game. He needed to make them feel the consequences in a way that would completely shatter their lives, just as they had done to his. Then there was Adela, Jasper's wife. Carson hadn't expected their paths to cross like this. He remembered the first time he met her almost by accident. He had gone to Jasper's office building to pick up Heather when he bumped into Adela in the parking lot. She seemed distracted, almost disoriented. Carson could tell something was wrong, but he didn't know just how deeply their fates would become entwined. After learning about the affair, Carson reached out to Adela. It was a risky move, but it was something he felt compelled to do. They met at a small coffee shop, far from prying eyes. When Carson slid the manila envelope across the table to Adela, her face was pale. She didn't need to open it to know what it contained. She had already suspected the truth. "They've been sleeping together, haven't they?" Adela asked, her voice trembling slightly. Carson nodded, not bothering to sugarcoat it. For years, he added. Adela exhaled sharply, closing her eyes for a moment before reopening them. There was pain in her gaze, yes, but there was also something else, determination. I don't want to be a victim in this, Adela said after a long pause, her hands gripping the edge of the table. I want to make them pay. Carson was taken aback by her intensity, but in a way, he admired it. There was a resolve in her eyes that mirrored his own. He felt the same. Together, they began to form a plan, one that would bring destruction to Jasper and Heather in ways they wouldn't expect. The following months were a careful game of patience and deception. Carson played his part flawlessly, maintaining the facade of a loving husband, attending events with Heather, engaging in small talk, pretending everything was fine. All the while, he was gathering evidence, working in the shadows with Adela to set their revenge into motion. Heather remained oblivious, still lost in the double life she was leading with Jasper. Every time she spoke his name, Carson's determination grew. It reminded him that this was necessary, that waiting for the right moment would make it all the more effective. The morning of the company party arrived, and Carson could feel the tension in the air. Heather seemed more on edge than usual, though she tried to mask it behind her usual calm demeanor. "Everything okay?" Carson asked, noticing how Heather kept glancing at her reflection in the mirror, adjusting her dress for what seemed like the 100th time. Her hands trembled slightly, her movements hurried. "Of course," she replied quickly, smoothing down her dress. "Just a little nervous about tonight." Carson nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly. He could tell she was lying, but it didn't matter anymore. "Well, you look great," he said, offering a smile that felt like a hollow gesture. Heather gave a half-hearted smile in return. "Thanks." She turned to leave the room, and Carson watched her go, knowing that tonight would mark the last time she would feel any semblance of control over her life. What she didn't know was that everything was about to change. Jasper and Heather had no idea what was coming for them. Carson's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from Adela. Everything set. He took a deep breath, glancing at the time. It was almost showtime. "Ready?" Heather asked, her voice full of false cheer as she appeared in the doorway. "Always," Carson replied, his tone steady. Tonight, the game would end. The ballroom was a picture of elegance. Chandeliers overhead casting soft light. The hum of conversation blending with the smooth jazz from the live band. Waiters moved gracefully through the crowd, offering trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres while laughter filled the air. But beneath the celebratory atmosphere, Carson felt a distinct shift. It was the calm before the storm. The anticipation of what he and Adela had set in motion gnawed at him, making it hard to fully engage with anyone around him. Heather stood by his side, looking every part the successful, confident woman. Her black dress shimmered in the soft lighting, and she moved through the crowd with practiced ease, shaking hands, laughing, and smiling. She looked like the perfect wife, the perfect colleague. Her eyes sparkled as she chatted with colleagues, her hand occasionally brushing against Carson's arm to give the illusion of unity. But Carson knew better. The distance between them was palpable. He watched as her gaze repeatedly drifted toward Jasper, her boss. Every time she looked at him, a small, secretive smile would appear on her lips, and Carson could feel the familiar knot tightening in his stomach. They weren't even trying to hide it tonight. From across the room, Carson could see the way Heather's hand lingered on Jasper's arm, how she leaned in just a little too close for it to be innocent. Carson stayed back, his gaze fixed on them, his eyes scanning every movement, every glance. He took a sip of his champagne, but the taste barely registered. He felt numb. Heather had already destroyed their marriage long before tonight, and yet here she was, pretending to be the perfect wife, the perfect partner. Carson knew she thought he was oblivious, that she and Jasper had been careful enough to keep their affair hidden. But tonight, the tables had turned. Carson had the upper hand. He caught sight of Adela in the crowd. She looked stunning in a simple but elegant gown. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment, and she gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. Carson knew everything was in place. Tonight, everything was going to unravel. "Enjoying yourself, Carson?" Heather's voice broke through his thoughts. She had appeared at his side, her face flushed from the excitement of the evening. Her eyes sparkled, but Carson could tell it wasn't because of him. "Yeah, it's been eventful," he replied, letting the double meaning of his words hang in the air. Heather smiled, though she didn't seem to catch the weight behind his response. Just then, Jasper walked over, drink in hand, his cocky grin impossible to miss. His arm brushed against Heather's as he approached, and Carson noticed the way she shifted slightly toward him, her posture changing. "Carson, my man," Jasper said, clapping him on the shoulder. Jasper greeted Carson with mock enthusiasm, his tone dripping with smugness. "You look like you're having a good time, right?" Carson met his gaze, feeling the familiar tightness in his chest, but his face remained impassive. "Sure, it's a good party," he replied flatly. Jasper chuckled, taking a long swig of his drink. He was clearly relishing the moment, his arrogance on full display. "Well, why wouldn't it be? We work hard, we play hard, right, babe?" he added, nudging Heather playfully. She let out a nervous laugh, her eyes flicking briefly toward Carson before quickly looking away. Carson didn't respond. His grip on his glass tightened as he felt the tension building between them. With every word from Jasper, the energy in the room shifted, becoming more charged, more cruel. Jasper seemed to thrive on this power, the way he believed he held the upper hand over Carson. But Carson wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Not yet, anyway. Jasper glanced at Heather, then back at Carson, his smirk widening. "You know what's funny, Carson? Your wife, she's got great taste. She really knows what she likes." He winked at Heather, who fidgeted with her drink, clearly uncomfortable but too afraid to stop him. Carson raised an eyebrow, feigning curiosity. "Oh, and what's that?" he asked, his voice calm, though the anticipation inside him was building. Jasper, emboldened by alcohol and his own overconfidence, leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone, but still loud enough for the small crowd around them to hear. "You see, Carson, I've been sleeping with your wife for years. And trust me, she prefers my Big Johnson over yours. Isn't that right, babe?" he said, turning toward Heather, who faltered in her smile. She gave a nervous giggle but didn't answer. Carson's eyes stayed locked on Jasper, letting the words hang in the air for a moment. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on them, some shocked, some entertained, others just waiting to see how he would react. But instead of anger, Carson felt a surprising calm. The moment had finally arrived. He smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that caught Jasper off guard. "Is that so?" Carson said quietly, his voice smooth, almost amused. Jasper's smirk faltered, confusion flashing across his face. Carson's lack of outrage was clearly throwing him off balance. "And you know what else?" Jasper continued, trying to regain his momentum. "Your kids? Yeah, they're mine too. You didn't even notice, did you?" The room seemed to shift uneasily. The crowd around them grew quiet, sensing that something darker was unfolding. Heather's face drained of color, her eyes wide with panic as she stared at Carson. But Carson didn't flinch. He didn't shout. Instead, he stepped closer to Jasper, never breaking his smile. "Just like I did with your wife," Carson said, his voice soft but sharp, cutting through the tension like a knife. Jasper blinked, his confident smirk wavering. Heather's hand flew to her mouth in shock, her eyes filled with panic. What are you talking about?" Jasper stammered, his bravado completely draining away. Carson's gaze flicked over to the entrance, and his eyes glinted with satisfaction. "Oh, we've got a surprise for you," he said, before anyone could respond. Suddenly, the ballroom doors swung open, and police officers in uniform entered, their presence a stark contrast to the glamour of the event. Gas erupted from the crowd as the officers moved swiftly through the room, heading straight for Jasper and Heather. "What the hell is this?" Jasper shouted, his voice rising in panic as he stepped backward, spilling his drink onto the floor. One of the officers stepped forward, his expression stern as he addressed Jasper. "Jasper Reynolds, you are under arrest for financial fraud and embezzlement." The color drained from Jasper's face. "This is ridiculous. You can't." The officer cut him off, his voice firm. "You have the right to remain silent." Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Heather staggered backward, her eyes wide with terror as the realization of what was happening sank in. She turned to Carson, her voice trembling. "Carson, please." Carson met her gaze, his expression cold. "It's over, Heather." The room had fallen silent. All eyes were on the unfolding drama. The festive atmosphere had evaporated, leaving only tension and confusion in its wake. For Jasper and Heather, their nightmare had just begun. Heather's heart pounded in her chest as the officers surrounded her and Jasper, their presence suffocating. The ballroom, once filled with laughter and chatter, now felt like a cold, empty space. "What the hell is going on?" Heather stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes frantically searched the room for answers, finally landing on Carson. He stood a few feet away, arms crossed, his face impassive. There was an eerie calmness to his demeanor, as though he had anticipated this moment. "This, Heather," Carson began slowly, his voice unervingly composed amidst the chaos, "is what happens when you mess with the wrong people." Jasper, who had been riding high on arrogance just moments before, was now visibly deflated. His face twisted in confusion as he tried to hold on to some semblance of bravado. "This is some kind of joke, right? You can't be serious." He turned to the police officers, gesturing dismissively with his hands. "You don't know who you're dealing with." One of the officers stepped forward, his expression stern and unmoved by Jasper's attempt at charm. "Mr. Reynolds, you're under arrest for multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Jasper's face twisted further, now in disbelief. "Fraud? Embezzlement? What the hell are you talking about?" Before he could argue any further, another voice cut through the thick air of tension. It was Adela, Jasper's wife, who had moved to the front of the crowd. Her face was calm, but there was a fiery intensity in her eyes. "It's not a joke, Jasper," she said flatly. "We've been planning this for months." Her gaze shifted to Heather, then back to Jasper, her voice dripping with contempt. "While you were busy sleeping with his wife, we were making sure all your dirty secrets came to light." Jasper's head snapped toward Adela, his confusion giving way to panic. "What? Adela, what are you talking about? This is insane." Heather, feeling the ground slip away beneath her, whispered the word, "exposed." Her voice was small, almost childlike, as though she hadn't yet comprehended the full weight of the situation. She looked at Carson, her eyes wide with confusion, silently begging for an explanation that might offer her some escape. Carson's eyes remained cold, distant. "Yeah, exposed. All the financial records, the shell companies, the fraudulent deals you helped cover up. Adela and I uncovered it all." Heather's breath hitched, her body going stiff. "Carson, I didn't know," she said, her voice filled with panic. She turned her gaze toward Jasper, whose face had now turned an unhealthy shade of pale. "You didn't tell me about any of this," she said, her words almost pleading. Jasper's expression shifted from confusion to raw terror. No longer was he the confident, smug man who had mocked Carson just moments ago. Now he was a man watching his empire crumble. Desperation in his eyes, he turned toward Heather. "I didn't tell you because I didn't think it would come to this. How the hell did this happen?" he demanded, panic rising in his voice. But Heather didn't answer. Her legs buckled beneath her, and she collapsed to the floor, her face wet with tears. "I didn't know," she repeated, her voice trembling with fear. I thought it was just us. I didn't know about any of this. I swear." Jasper remained silent. He was too busy grappling with the realization that everything he had built was now slipping through his fingers. His eyes darted around the room, looking for a way out, but the walls seemed to close in tighter with every passing second. The officers moved quickly. Jasper tried to pull away as they grabbed his arms, but his resistance was weak, his struggles half-hearted. "You can't do this," he shouted, his voice hoarse with panic. "I'll have your jobs for this. You don't know who I am." The officer reading him his rights remained stoic. "You're entitled to a lawyer, Mr. Reynolds. Anything further you want to say can be said in court." "Adela, watching her husband being restrained, stepped forward. Her eyes never left his. Her voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable finality in it. "I hope all the lies were worth it, Jasper. The affairs, the deceit, the money. Was it worth destroying everything?" For the first time that evening, Jasper had no answer. His face was pale, his once arrogant smirk now completely erased. As the officers led him away, hands cuffed behind his back, he seemed smaller, more fragile, with every step. Heather's sobs grew louder as she watched the man she had betrayed everything for being dragged out of the ballroom like a criminal. She turned toward Carson, her tear-streaked face full of desperation. "Carson, please. I didn't know about the money. I didn't know about any of this. I was stupid," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "I made a mistake. But I love you. Please don't let them take me too. We can fix this. We can fix us, right?" Carson looked down at her, his face betraying no emotion. He had waited for this moment for so long. He had imagined it, replayed it in his mind countless times. And now, as it unfolded before him, he realized that there was no sense of triumph. There was nothing. The woman kneeling before him, begging for his forgiveness, was not the woman he had married. She was no longer the woman he had once loved. That person had disappeared long ago. "There's nothing left to fix, Heather," Carson said quietly, yet with a finality that brought Heather's sobbing to an abrupt halt. "You destroyed everything. You made your choices." Heather reached for his hand, but he stepped back, avoiding her touch. "Please, Carson, I'll do anything. I'll leave him. I'll leave everything behind. We can start over." Carson cut her off, his voice stronger now. "Start over? Heather, it's over. You slept with him. You lied. For years, you betrayed me. And now you want to act like none of that matters? No. You made your bed, and now you're going to lie in it." Heather's face crumpled as Carson's words sank in. She had known, deep down, that this day might come, but she had never truly believed it. She had always thought she could somehow fix what she had broken. But now, as she looked up at Carson's cold, distant expression, she understood. There was no coming back from this. The officers moved toward her, ready to escort her out. Heather didn't resist. She had no fight left in her. Trembling, she stood, her sobs shaking her body, as she was led out of the ballroom, just like Jasper. As the doors closed behind them, the room was left in stunned silence. The party-goers, who had witnessed everything, were frozen, unsure of how to react. Carson turned away, feeling a strange sense of closure. He glanced at Adela, standing near the back of the room, her face a mix of relief and sorrow. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, they shared a silent understanding. They had both lost something, but they had also regained something else, freedom. Without another word, Carson turned and walked out of the ballroom, leaving behind the wreckage of a life that no longer belonged to him. In the months that followed the unraveling at the company party, chaos and legal drama dominated the headlines. Jasper's arrest for financial fraud became a spectacle, his once mighty empire reduced to rubble. The lavish parties, the high society connections, the wealth, all of it vanished in the blink of an eye. Every detail of his corrupt dealings came to light, and he quickly became a pariah, both in the business world and his personal life. Jasper's trial was swift. The evidence Carson and Adela had gathered, meticulously documented and irrefutable, left no room for him to escape. He was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, and with it, the privileges and power he had once enjoyed came crashing down. As Carson sat in the gallery, watching the verdict unfold, he felt no joy, only a strange sense of finality. Meanwhile, Heather's world crumbled. She was left with nothing. The glamorous life she had built with Jasper, fueled by their affair, collapsed along with his fraudulent empire. The luxurious home she had flaunted, the indulgence she had reveled in, all disappeared. She was forced to move into a small, run-down apartment, far removed from the life she had once known. But it wasn't just the material losses that haunted her. Heather's social circle, once filled with friends who had admired her success and status, now turned their backs on her. They whispered behind her back, their smiles replaced with cold stares and pitying glances. She was no longer the confident, beautiful woman who could walk into any room and command attention. Now, she was the woman who had destroyed her marriage, ruined her family, and lost everything in the process. In the wreckage of her life, Heather turned to the one person she thought she could rely on, Carson. She sent him countless messages filled with apologies, voicemails begging him to meet her, to talk, to reconsider. She stood outside his new home on several occasions, crying, hoping for a glimpse of him. Each message echoed with the same refrain, "I'm sorry. Please, Carson, I made a mistake. We can fix this." But Carson had moved on. One afternoon, as he sat at his kitchen table, sipping coffee, his phone buzzed again. Heather's name flashed across the screen. He stared at it for a moment before letting it go to voicemail, just as he had done countless times before. He didn't need to hear her apologies anymore. The betrayal had severed whatever bond had once existed between them. Later that day, Carson listened to one of the recent messages, his finger hovering over the delete button. Heather's voice was raw, broken. "Carson, I don't know what to do. I've lost everything. I made a mistake. I know that now. Please, just give me one more chance. I still love you." He paused for a moment, feeling a flicker of something deep inside, perhaps pity, but it wasn't enough. He deleted the message without responding. Heather's desperation only grew in the following weeks. She showed up at Carson's workplace, her eyes hollow, her face twisted with anguish. "Carson, please, just 5 minutes. Let me explain. I wasn't thinking clearly. Carson cut her off, his voice quiet yet firm. "There's nothing left to say, Heather. You made your choices." Heather's face crumpled as tears began to spill from her eyes. "But we were good together, Carson. We had kids, a life." Carson's expression remained calm, though his voice carried the weight of everything they had lost. "That life is over. You destroyed it." As Heather collapsed into sobs, Carson turned away, walking back into the building without another word. The door shut behind him, closing off the last remnants of a past he no longer wanted to be a part of. While Heather's world spiraled downward, Carson and Adela's bond only deepened. What had begun as a shared mission for revenge slowly transformed into something far more real and unexpected. They understood each other in ways no one else could. Both had been betrayed. Both had suffered the same emotional scars. And in that shared pain, they found solace in one another's company. It began with long conversations over coffee, sharing stories of their pasts, regrets, and hopes for the future. Adela had been through the same hurt as Carson, and together, they began to heal. The comfort they found in each other was undeniable, and over time, their connection evolved. Friendship turned into something more, something neither had anticipated, but both embraced. One evening, as they sat on Carson's porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Adela broke the silence. "You know," she said softly, "I never thought I'd be here. After everything with Jasper, I didn't think I'd ever trust anyone again." Carson glanced at her, noticing how the fading sunlight illuminated her face. "I didn't either," he admitted. "But here we are." Adela smiled, a small, genuine smile that Carson had come to love. Here we are. Their relationship blossomed naturally. It wasn't rushed or forced. It grew steadily, as if it had always been meant to be. Soon, they began talking about the future, not just what they wanted from each other, but from life itself. Before long, Carson realized he had fallen in love with Adela, not because of their shared pain, but because of who she was. One summer evening, in an intimate and quiet ceremony, Carson and Adela were married. It was nothing like the lavish wedding Carson had once shared with Heather. This one was simple, attended by only a handful of close friends and family. It wasn't about the spectacle. It was about them, about the life they had built together, a life founded on trust and understanding. As they exchanged vows, Carson felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time: peace. Meanwhile, Heather's life continued its downward spiral. She was left to pick up the pieces alone, haunted by the choices she had made. Her attempts to reconcile with Carson eventually faded as she came to the painful realization that he was never coming back. The love she had once taken for granted was gone forever, replaced by the cold, hard truth of her mistakes. Carson never looked back. He and Adela built a life full of laughter, joy, and the kind of love that had long been absent from Carson's life. Their home was warm, filled with the comfort of knowing they had survived the worst and come out stronger on the other side. Heather, on the other hand, spent her days lingering in the shadows of her old life, a constant reminder of everything she had lost. Her relationship with Jasper had ended in ruins, and her family had disowned her after the public disgrace. The woman who had once had everything was now left with nothing but her regrets. Carson had moved on, and for the first time in years, he was truly happy. The years had been kind to both him and Adela. Their lives flourished in ways they had never imagined during the storm of betrayal and heartache. Now, as they stood on the balcony of their new home, a beautiful house perched on a quiet hill overlooking a sprawling valley, the golden rays of the setting sun bathed the landscape in a serene glow. The colors of twilight danced across the horizon. Carson wrapped his arm around Adela's waist as they watched the sun sink lower, the sky awash with pinks and oranges. There was a tranquility in the air, one they had both longed for, but hadn't been sure they would ever find again. Yet here they stood, years removed from the chaos of their past, sharing the warmth of a peaceful evening. Carson took a deep breath, feeling the cool breeze caress his skin. "I never imagined I could feel this at peace," he murmured, his voice heavy with the weight of everything they had endured. Adela, leaning gently against him, smiled softly and rested her head on his shoulder. "We earned this," she replied, her voice quiet but steady. It hadn't been an easy journey for either of them. The scars left by their former spouses ran deep, and there had been times when the future seemed uncertain. Yet, through it all, Carson and Adela had remained by each other's side, navigating the ups and downs of rebuilding their lives. Now, the darkness of those earlier days seemed distant, mere shadows of a past that no longer held power over them. "I sometimes think about how different things could have been," Carson said after a pause, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. He wasn't speaking out of regret, for he had none. Rather, he was reflecting on how surreal their journey had been. Adela nodded, understanding his meaning. "Me too. It's strange, isn't it? How something so painful can lead to something so perfect." Carson chuckled softly. "Yeah, I think we were both too stubborn to let the past win." Adela pulled back slightly, looking up at him with a thoughtful expression. "Stubborn? Maybe. Or maybe we just knew deep down that there was something better waiting for us." Their eyes locked, and for a long moment, they stood in silence, their connection deepening without the need for words. The quiet comfort between them spoke volumes. Their love hadn't been built on grand gestures or sweeping romance. It was founded on the steady, reliable companionship that had grown between them over time. Carson thought back to the anger, the betrayal, and the humiliation he had felt when he first discovered Heather's affair. It had consumed him, pushing him toward revenge. But now, looking at Adela, he realized that what they had now wasn't just the result of vengeance. It was the outcome of choosing to move forward together. The satisfaction of seeing Jasper and Heather's downfall had been sweet, but what he and Adela had now was sweeter. "Revenge is sweet," Carson mused, a small, satisfied smile curling at his lips. He remembered the day everything had fallen apart for Heather and Jasper. The rush of power he'd felt as their smug expressions faltered, as their lies unraveled before their eyes. It had been a moment of triumph. But Adela, ever wise, smiled gently and said, "But love is sweeter." Carson's smile softened. She was right as always. Revenge had been fleeting, a brief victory. But what they had together was enduring. The true reward had been finding each other in the wake of all their pain. Behind them, the house was filled with reminders of their new life. Pictures of their travels adorned the walls. There were snapshots of weekends spent hiking in the mountains, of quiet trips to the beach, and evenings in charming little towns. It wasn't a life of extravagance or grandeur, but one of simplicity, happiness, and genuine contentment. Each photo was a testament to the life they had created, not in spite of their pasts, but because of them. Carson turned slightly, catching a glimpse of one of the framed pictures through the glass door behind them. It was from their wedding day, a modest ceremony held in the backyard of their former home. There had been no extravagant reception, no grand guest list, just a small group of friends and family who had supported them through it all. That day had solidified their bond, not just as survivors of betrayal, but as partners in a new chapter of life. The sound of laughter from inside the house broke Carson's reverie. Their children, Adela's son from her marriage to Jasper and Carson's 2 kids, were playing a board game in the living room, their voices full of playful competition. Carson smiled, feeling grateful for how seamlessly their families had blended together. "They've gotten so close," Adela remarked, following his gaze inside. "I was worried at first, but look at them." "Yeah," Carson agreed, a swell of pride in his chest. "They've come a long way just like us." There had been moments early on when blending their families had seemed like another insurmountable challenge. But the kids had adjusted far better than either of them had hoped. Carson's children, once a painful reminder of Heather's betrayal, had become his greatest joy, his true legacy. And as for Adela's son, he had found in Carson the father figure that Jasper had never been, and their bond had grown into something strong and meaningful. Carson turned back to Adela, pulling her closer. "You know," he said, his voice soft and intimate, "there was a time when Carson thought happiness was beyond his reach. He believed the betrayal from Heather, the deceit from Jasper, would break him. But now, standing with Adela in the quiet of the evening, he felt a peace he had never imagined. I never thought I'd get here," he said, his voice quiet but filled with depth. "After everything, what Heather did, what Jasper did, I thought it would be the end of me." Adela looked up at him, her gaze warm and reassuring. "And now?" she asked softly. Carson's eyes met hers, and for a moment, they simply held each other's gaze. "And now," he said, his voice softening even further, "I'm standing here with you, and I know it was all worth it. Every struggle, every hardship, it led me to you." He paused, his chest tight with emotion. "I love you, Adela." A tear shimmered in Adela's eye as she smiled up at him, her voice a whisper. "I love you too, Carson." They stood there in silence, side by side, watching the sun sink lower and the valley below them turn into a deep, tranquil blue. The weight of the past seemed to vanish with each passing moment, fading into nothing. In that moment, all the ghosts of their pasts, the betrayal, the lies, the pain, felt distant, as if they belonged to another life. Jasper and Heather, once so central to their world, were now nothing more than faint echoes, mere footnotes in the story of their lives. Their toxic presence had long since faded, their lives broken and scattered, while Carson and Adela had moved forward into something better, something far beyond what revenge could offer. The stars began to appear in the sky, twinkling softly above them, and Carson kissed the top of Adela's head. "We've come so far," he said quietly, the words almost lost in the stillness of the night. Adela nodded, her head resting against his chest, her voice content. "We have, and the best part," Carson continued, his words full of hope, "the rest of our lives are just beginning." Together, they stood in the fading light, their hearts at peace, no longer haunted by the ghosts of the past, but looking forward to all the new memories they would create. The future stretched out before them, bright and full of promise.